Well, folks, welcome to the RSP cast. I'm Matt Waldman, and joining me this week is Nick Whalen. Nick and I used to work together at the RSP back in the early days, and Nick does some fantastic work with his Debbie report. He also does fantastic work at a variety of Dynasty sites over the years. Where are you at right now, like that you for people can find you?
Yeah, Dynasty Nerds is where I do. We have a show that we do like college prospects, and then
Yeah.
I started a YouTube channel, which I mean I don't know. We'll see how it goes. It's video editing and all that kind of stuff, but it's football, which I like.
Yeah.
So
That's cool. Yeah. And Nick had this really good video out on his site that was called Real Talk, REEL,
hmm
TALK. And we got together because we on Twitter, I was going over some Jonathan Taylor tape from the Chicago game. And there were people in the Chicago or in the Indianapolis community who were on Twitter who were basically comparing Jonathan Taylor to Trent Richardson. So, and they're basically freaking out that they were having this neuroses that Jonathan Taylor was going to be Trent Richardson and that this was an awful pick and that he was, and there were some videos out that people were citing as evidence that he was that he was Trent Richardson. So somebody shared with me Nick's video and I hadn't watched it yet, but I was like, well, let me watch it because I know Nick and I know that if he had some serious concerns, I've got to see what this is about. But I'm just going through the Chicago tape through that and going, I don't see anything wrong with him here. I don't see anything wrong with him here. I mean, yeah, he could probably do this a little bit better. But so I kind of hit him up privately and was just like, I looked at your tape and there were a couple things that I thought were kind of debatable, but I want to go over with them again with you just kind of to see where we both stand, because I think there's things I could learn from what you were looking at. And then, of course, when we looked at it again, it was I was like, well, why didn't he do that? Or why didn't he do this? And what was kind of funny was it was just kind of a lesson of, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, but it was for overall, it was just kind of a lesson for me. It was kind of funny because when the first time I watched it, I was in a hurry because I'm bleary-eyed doing literally tweeting everything I can collect for a Football Guys article that I do on Sundays. So when I ran through it the first time, I was like, okay, I can see Nick's point. Okay, well, maybe that one, I don't know. Let me go back and I'll look at that later. Okay, I'll go back. And so then when we did look at it together, what we found was, at least from my standpoint was, no, he's not the next Trent Richardson. He knows what he's doing for the most part in terms of certain schemes, certain run blocking schemes. But there were instances where he clearly missed creases, where he clearly didn't read leverage, where he clearly wasn't patient enough, where he was too reliant on certain types of footwork. And as a result of that, I could see your points that he needs to get better. He's not trash as a prospect, but he certainly isn't where people would expect him to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and part of that too is it gets you a little bit hopeful, that the opportunities are there, and he's just not taking the next step. And you had asked me, Matt, and obviously we're friends, and I was like, oh, I get to talk ball with Matt, oh man, it didn't even matter when it was, and that talk turned from a half hour on Jonathan Taylor to 2.5 hours on everything about football and life. And it was awesome. But I learned a lot from, just breaking that down with you, because that's what I think we like the most is when you can have somebody that, breaks things down. There's parts that you miss. And the thing that I took the most away from what you had talked about was, well, one of many is where his feet were placed, and which allowed him to cut. I'm like, man, that's something I don't think about when I watch running backs, but you're so detailed in everything that you do. It was really cool. So now when I'm looking at running backs, now I'm like, okay, how is his foot placed and how would that affect his angles and his acceleration?
Well, it's funny because I had the same learning experience with you, because one of the things that I didn't look at was whether the running back is under balance, like his feet are under his shoulders and he's in a balanced position before he makes a cut, because it's so obvious that I felt like I was laughing thinking how do I not think about this from that perspective, which is that, yeah, the guy's not going to be able to make the cut and get into and change the direction that he wants to be able to change to if he's not under balance before he makes the cut.
Mm-hmm.
So, so it was funny. We both had that. And and I knew to kind of contact Nick. And this is kind of one of those things that, when you're on Twitter and people are like throwing stuff and they're going, well, the argument that we're saying here is, look at Nick's argument with this. And I'm sitting there going, well, I know Nick, but I don't know Nick's process. So let me and I know Nick well and we're friends. And it's just like, I'm not going to sit here and go on Twitter and go, Nick's wrong. Because I have no idea. Let's look at it and see. So when I looked at it, it was funny because you look at the process, and what I contacted him and said, hey man, I don't want to, I didn't want to start anything stupid on Twitter that was just hasty. And I've done that recently, like Jay Moyer, who's a writer on our, our show. Yeah. He's a great guy. And he's also a guy that's very appreciative of running back play. He was really high on Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I was so on Clyde Edwards-Helaire. But I didn't think he was a bad back. I just didn't think he was a top 5 back. But I just one night Friday, I think I quote tweeted him, and I wasn't thinking of that as a negative thing, but he was. And so he emailed me, he texted me, he was like, we had a debate about it, and then we kind of argued about it, but it wasn't really mean-spirited at all. And by the end of it was kind of funny because they were friends of ours who were mutual friends of ours who were like, Mom, Dad, stop fighting. And we're kind of laughing about it. But we were both had the same point of view. It's like for him, it's like all he had been hearing was how bad Clyde Edwards-Helaire was because Le'Veon Bell got traded to the Chiefs, or got added to the Chiefs. And I was thinking, all I hear is how he's going to be a top 5 back, and everyone's doubling down on him being a top 5 talent in fantasy football this year, where I'm like, maybe next year, maybe a year or two from now, but he's not there. And stop pushing that kid to be all that. He's, here I have issues with that. And it was the same thing with Jonathan Taylor, where it was like, you were like, slow the train down a little bit. And I'm like, the train isn't stuck on the tracks. Let's just keep it moving. But we were just coming from the opposite directions and had the same points of view.
Yeah.
So what were some of the things, just for people who were like, well, this is all nice, good and well that we're talking about Jonathan Taylor, but we're talking around him. So what were your thoughts, in terms of this video that people can look at on your channel, in terms of overall about Jonathan Taylor?
Yeah, I think a lot of it he's in his head, and I think it's important to know at any player, who you are. What do you do best? What do you not do best? And then obviously you can come a little ways and improve on what you're not good at, but do the things that you're good at. That's what Belichick is so good at. And so, Taylor stopping his feet and trying to make people miss and trying to be a little fancy, I think at times has really hindered his, to quote, who's that Dallas running back? He left some meat on the bone. Who's that running back?
Yes. Oh, that wasn't Dunbar, was it? No. Hambrick, Troy Hambrick.
No, it wasn't Troy Hambrick. No. I was thinking Tashard Choice. That's not right either.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter. He left some some yards out there, and then also within the zone scheme, he's just not used to pressing outside and then looking back inside for these lanes that are potentially there. His biggest concern is, I'm going to get downhill as soon as I can. And I'm just going to get my shoulders square and I'm going to go. And to me, it's almost like coaches like, hey, you have to run straight and you have to run hard and you have to get your yards, instead of letting things work, because that's how zone works. You have to really be patient and let that great offensive line and Quentin Nelson work in front of you. So there's some pieces to him being comfortable at the NFL level with those different, size athletes moving around in front of him, and scheme, I think, that he just doesn't have a knack for yet.
Yeah, it was like he wasn't nuanced enough in traffic, and then in space he was too cute.
Yep.
Like he was trying to be too nuanced, so he had it completely reversed. And it was interesting because there were some clear leverage reads where he's reading the blockers and he just cuts right into them, or heads right into the leverage advantage to the defense, where we were literally watching. And I was like, what's he doing? Like, what was he thinking? And it was, so we both were kind of laughing about that. And then we started, talking about footwork in general and running back footwork and how that, and one of those things when it comes to pressing was how, like, people were worried about him being Trent Richardson. And the reason why he's not Trent Richardson is that, Taylor does show some ability to press and cut. It's just not as nuanced as it needs to be. He's not completely unfamiliar with it in the way that Trent Richardson, it was just alien to him, like to be able to do that in the same way that it was kind of alien to Lawrence Maroney and CJ Spiller. Those were other backs who kind of had troubles with those types of looks. And so when you look at him, it was fascinating because we started talking about, Marlon Mack and how he was ahead of where Marlon Mack was, but he didn't have the luxury of having Frank Gore. And so we watched like a Twitter video I'd done years ago of Frank Gore.
That was fun.
And it was great because it's like this, nobody looks at it because we're geeking out over it, but like, I was laughing because I said, I think I had like 2 likes on that whole video, but it's still like, it's this great video against a Monday night game against the Broncos where they show a Marlon Mack play on like a 3rd and 1 where he like presses the crease, but he doesn't really get tight enough. And getting tight enough really is about getting like literally like within inches of the heels of the blockers, like really getting up there and cutting your stride length. Or if you're going to do any type of jump stop or jump cut, you're doing it on a level where that you're hopping into a space where you can control that depth, where you're not going to run into the backside of the blocker. And so Mack, you see him try to press, but then he tries to, he doesn't really get close enough, and when he tries to make the cut back, the defender on the outside is able to just swoop in and wrap him. And then when you look at Gore, the old man gets out there and literally he not only presses and then makes a cut, the cut's to bait the defender who's in the hole, and he moves the defender out of the hole, and he's literally like a fly on the jersey of his blockers. He's so tight to those guys, and then makes another cut and ends up gaining like 5 yards on the play. And it's just like the nuance that he has to do that is the exact reason why like he's 37 and still in the league. And so
carries.
Yeah. And it's like, when people talk about having that ability, it's like, it's a lot like route running because it's, when you're pressing the crease, linebackers are reading you and going, okay, he's setting me up to go here. But the setup can either be great enough that the linebacker has to be compelled to move because they're reading the hips or they're reading the knees of the blocker, or it can be semi-compelling, but then the most nuanced running backs make a second move where it's like the linebacker's thinking, oh, that's the direction he's going to go. And then that's actually the bait. They go one step further with the bait. But I just started watching DeAndre Swift against Jacksonville. He had that 123-yard day. So I was watching him, and I've got something coming out on him. And I noticed the same things with him that are kind of with Jonathan Taylor. It's like he's trying to be something he's not right now. And I think part of that is he's watching Adrian Peterson in practice like day after day. And you see some of these plays where he's like jump stopping and jump cutting. And it's like he's opening his hips and pointing that toe to get in the direction, but he's like using jump stops, and then he's not under balance to make the cut. And then in other plays, he's totally like feet still on the ground, really great pressure cuts and like great quickness in and out of those cuts. And on those plays, he's getting positive yards. Right. And the other ones, when he's trying to bounce outside, nothing. Like he's getting stopped because he's not being able to make a sharp enough cut because he wasted space.
And we had talked about too, because all the things we're talking about are these really important details of being a running back. And so many times people throw out, well, anybody can play running back. What's their 40 time? What's their 3 cone? And there's so many things to it where you had talked about setting up that linebacker is like being a wide receiver. It's also like you're a quarterback, and you want to hit this seam, on the right. So you're going to look to your left and you're going to move that safety in one high, or cover 3, however you want to word it, and then come back to the seam because there's a hole. That's how you can move linebackers at the second level, where you can start one way, set them into a combo block, and now you got a hole. Where that's something they have to look at pre-snap. Okay, where's the front at? Like, they have to do that homework in their head. That's what Frank Gore's so good. Frank Gore pre-snaps so well and sets up where things are going to happen. Where I just did a Kenyon Drake video too, Matt, on Real Talk, and there's one where he doesn't cut back in a zone where it would have been great. He went the other way, which was also an open hole, and ran right into a safety that was already walked down in the box. So if he was doing that work already, he would know where he's going, and that's just the mental part of it. That's not the footwork and the balance and everything else that we're talking about, but it's so nuanced where there's a reason why Christine Michael and Spiller and all these guys didn't pan out, and other guys that aren't sexy, Arian Foster and etc., but they know how to play the position so well, succeed a ton, and for a long time, even like Frank Gore.
Yeah, and a lot of that is when you talk about people value the athletic part more than they think about the actual technical and conceptual part of running. It's because there was somebody who a while back, I won't mention who because I don't want to put that person in a horrible light, but we had a debate on Twitter a few years ago where this guy basically said, running back is not only so easy, it may be the easiest position to transition to in the NFL, and it's just an instinctive position. And like he made it, and he literally characterized it as instinctive on the same level that I would say like somebody would say acting is instinctive or playing music is instinctive. And it's just like, oh, well, they just have the gift because they come from this part of the country, or they come from this culture and they all dance or they all do this. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, yeah, it's not that person was like, a hateful human being or saying it. They weren't even thinking on that level, but like, it's akin to that. It's akin to that kind of thought process. It's a level of ignorance.
Or they all go to the same school, so all of them have to be bussed. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like, exactly.
That doesn't matter at all.
Helmet scouting, logo scouting, exactly. Yep. And it's just like, when you look at running back play, there's just so much to it in terms of like all the footwork patterns that are involved. I mean, like, I remember there was a Derrick Henry video where Paul Kuharski, after an initial practice in like this early summer, he had videotaped Derrick Henry going through some footwork drills, and he was kind of tripping over himself, and he was like, I realize that this may be like a new drill for him, but still, this isn't like the footwork of a first round pick, is it? And like people were all freaking out, and so I consulted my buddy Chad Spann, who was over at Northern Illinois, who I've talked about a lot and have had on this show. And he's coached running backs in the pros and in high school and college and played, in the NFL and the CFL. And he wrote an article for me. It was basically, I just edited a little bit, but he, it was great right from the get-go. It was basically like, look, Derrick Henry has good footwork. There's nothing wrong with his footwork. This was a completely new drill. And this is normally what happens. Here's what the drill is. Here's, basically explain the drill down to the nth degree, explain what happens with these types of drills, and how that running backs are always trying to acquire new different types of footwork, components, because it's like, just like in music or just like in stage theater where you're learning like different types of movement that you can incorporate when you improvise, or different types of licks that you would play on a solo over certain types of harmonies. You have to practice that to the point that like, it's not even something you think about. A famous musician that, used to play with a guy by the name of Miles Davis. If you guys aren't, jazz aficionados, Chick Corea is like a great pianist. And he was doing a master class talking about knowing versus remembering, or memorization versus knowing. And so a lot of people think, a lot of people who are talking about he's got to learn this, or he's got to respond or think about these things while it's on the field, they're missing the point between memorizing and knowing. Like, memorizing is basically, the way Chick Corea described it was that your mind is literally visualizing the thing on the page or the image that you had of some sort of concept that you're learning, that you wanted to learn, and just reading it back or reviewing it. And that conscious act of reviewing or rereading takes time. It takes a lot more time than knowing.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing is that muscle memory that you have when you breathe, when you eat, when you walk down some stairs. You may not have, it may have taken you a couple of years to learn how to walk down some stairs and not be in danger as a little kid, but now that now you're an adult, unless something happened to you, walking down the stairs is no different than breathing or eating,
Mm-hmm.
Or driving. Same thing with driving. Like, you can ride a bike, all those things, all those motor memory things, the muscle memory things that you learn. And it's the same thing with reading the line, and understanding that, you're not sitting there doing calculus going, well, the helmet of the left, of the left defensive end is over the left tackle's inside shoulder, so therefore I should be doing this.
Mm-hmm.
You're just reading flashes of information, but you've studied that enough you've had to break it down in the film and go, okay, when the helmet comes here, I need to be able to press a couple more steps towards where that helmet is heading and then make my cut back over to this side. And after he's done that in the classroom, there are a few people in the world, or every year, there are a few people every year who can look at that tape and then just do that,
Mm-hmm.
In practice. Not many,
Mm-hmm.
but like there's guys like Dexter McCluster out of Ole Miss who could do that. Yeah. He could do that. And people were just wowed by the fact that he could take a concept off the tape or off of the classroom and apply it onto the practice field. The problem is that he just wasn't an elite running back. He was kind of a tweener type of football player physically. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But like if Adrian Peterson could have done that, he'd be even greater than what he is.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like that. Usually that means then they got to go out in the field and they've got to visualize those instances. Like they may, before even practice, they may be like setting up cones and visualizing, okay, I've got to run to this cone and I'm going to set my footwork pattern to do these types of patterns to set up and imagine the helmet coming inside over that end. And then I'm going to make that cut. Mm-hmm. So like they're literally practicing those things to the point where it's like, they don't have to think about it anymore, but there are some things that they do naturally. Some guys naturally may have a great jump cut. Some guys naturally may have a great ability to open their hips and they can do that and they lean on that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But the very best hone all those different things and they can recall them, but it takes not only hours and hours of practice for years before they get to that level, but it takes maintenance practice to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's why sometimes guys aren't as sharp when they come back from injury.
Oh, yeah.
Or they go to a new scheme and they're not used to a certain type of play. Yeah, or teammates.
Yeah, rapport, how they're going to react. I mean, I was actually talking, and I know you know Matt Caraccio. He's a good friend of mine. He called me on Sunday, and it was one of those things where it was meant to be a 5-minute conversation, and it's like me and you, Matt, it turned into like an hour, and we're just talking, and one thing I love that we used to have a podcast together, but he talked about having this toolbox. But what we got talking about was some of the things we talked about actually the other week, Matt, was, when you're playing, you're not just, okay, go here, do this, because all these parts are moving in front of you and you have to use all of your senses. You have to see it. You have to feel it, all of these things, anticipate, like all of these, imagine all these things that's going on in front of you together with that reaction time, and that's what makes it so hard, because, you're like, okay, well, this is where I should go. You know what I mean? But everything could change. One guy could crash and shoot a gap. Now what? Now, because honestly, it's a chaos when it's out there. And that's what some people that are very mechanic struggle playing, because it's an art form. It's so creative, and it's, guys that can string together. That's why I love Cordell Patterson so much. He makes anybody miss in such a wide variety of ways because he's an artist out there of what he does, instead of, well, I just run hard over one person continually, like is what that's what Cam Akers is kind of doing. You can't just do one thing continually. You have to have a wide array. And then you can't think like, okay, I'm going to get past here. Then I'm going to do this one spin move. And then I'm going to cut to the left, and like these guys are magically going to do everything that you want. It's kind of a, it's an art, and there's timing, and there's everything has to go together. And where you have to figure this stuff out and add these tools is in practice with what you're talking about with Henry. And it takes a certain kind of person, because that's where you're going to hone in and be like, okay, I'm going to work on my jump cut. I'm going to work on this cut. I'm going to work on crossover, switch arms, whatever. But you also have to have a certain type of a mindset, Matt. And I know you're doing this right now. We talked before of practicing even when you're not good. You have to practice something. You're like, you know what? I'm going to do it in practice and just see if this works. And it might not work, and be okay to fail, because that's where you learn new stuff. In the game, you do whatever it is to be effective and get something done. But you have to be okay with, you know what, I'm going to throw this into tight coverage and it might be a pick. That's okay in practice. It's going to count in a game. But man, what if I get it in there and I get this skill down, and it's going to be fine. And I'm going to tell you a funny story, Matt. When I was in the 4th grade, and I've always been this kind of a weird football mind. In the 4th grade, when I figured out I could throw the football into tight coverage when the guy wasn't looking and complete to my receiver. I was in the 4th grade when I learned that. I still remember I did that. I was like, oh my gosh, that happened. And it always stuck, because that's something that's really effective and you see happen. But if I never took the risk to do that, you would never get the benefits from it. So it takes a confident person, okay to fail.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And then it also takes understanding what setting where you can do that. Like if you're Tom Brady, you can practice to failure, like, because no one's taking your job, like not at this point. Now if you're a free agent, if you're a UDFA in your first camp, well, whatever it is you need to practice, you better be practicing that after hours and beforehand, because you're in or the same thing with like Tony Gonzalez. The Tony Gonzalez story that I love is the one that he talked about during the all-time team that they just had recently put out this past year. And they asked him about how he was like one of the league leaders in drops in his 2nd year. And like, he just had an awful year. And he said, he was distraught over it and depressed. And he literally like started reading all these like self-help books and like different coaching things. And his brother was sending him stuff. And then finally, like, during the off season and then from camp onward heading into his 3rd year, he literally like would practice before practice and after practice, catching balls different ways, making sure he knew he was looking it in, that he had his hands in the right position, that he understood the positions he was supposed to do. He ran all sorts of different routes to make sure that he could get comfortable putting his hands in those positions, on those routes with the right timing. And then he would call one of his coaches over and go, okay, before practice, I need you to throw me balls here. Like every day we're doing this, after practice, every day doing that. And so that he worked around it, because he knew that like if he was going to try and think and take chances while they're trying to, install something or they're having a scrimmage, and he already had like a rough part of the year, what he didn't want to do was take chances heading into his 3rd year where he could lose his job. Like he was going to do what he did well and then incorporate that in as it became muscle memory. And so there's that strategy too that you kind of have to consider sometimes.
And like isn't that just like a life lesson, like right there? Like I bet Tony Gonzalez would not have been who he was if he didn't have that adversity. And then he had this work ethic and this mindset that, you know what, I got to work on these little bitty things so much. I mean, we know with all of the greats, and that's one thing I always try to convey with, I'm a counselor to my students or whomever, is like Jordan getting cut, Brady splitting time with Drew Henson, and, like right there, like then it's in their mind where, or Rod Smith always having, that mindset that he's the undrafted free agent, he's going to get cut, that they have to work on these little things all the time, even no matter where you are and how great you are, because when you don't do that, you start losing. And that's one thing that I love when I scout college guys is I want to see them improve in parts of their game over their career. And I'm like, man, this guy could really be like Andy Dalton. Andy Dalton continually got better when he's at TCU. And I was like, he could actually maybe be, a starter. I know he just had a bad game, but like, and he's had a good career for, his skill set and where he came from.
Yeah. And certainly, it's always about your audience with all of this that we're doing. Obviously I have a big fantasy component of the audience here, but most of my audience understands that I like, that scouting is the main thing for this particular podcast and for a lot of stuff, the work that's being done here. And so from a scouting perspective, Andy Dalton has had an excellent career. To be a starter in the NFL is an excellent career. To be a top tier backup that you're wanted on that level, that's great. To make an NFL team is great. And that's one of those things that, that failure component is important. Because at the same time, even like quarterbacking for sure, like when it comes to quarterback evaluation, I've had this discussion with Russ Landy when we did Scout Talk series for a while last year on this show. But one of the things we talk about is that you really can't judge a quarterback after, one season. It's really got to be a season and a half to 2 seasons, maybe even 3 seasons, depending on what the dynamic of what's going on with him is. But it's like certainly not 8 to 14, not 8 to 16 games, because the way the NFL works, they scout they tend to scout 4 to 6 weeks behind what's actually happening, which is why you see like early on players do really well and they're doing this thing over and over again. And teams just seem to be caught with their pants down like week after week. And you're like, how do they not see this? Like we've seen this like 4 times already. And here comes the big play. You can almost guess it if you're watching them every week. And then like somewhere around week 5, week 6, suddenly the gate closes and like that's not there anymore. How come they're not being able to do that anymore? Because defenses took it away and now they're making them do something else. And it's like, we saw it with Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield came in after Tyrod Taylor and basically had had productive weeks. He had productive box score weeks. Now, was he doing stuff that was he doing things that he wasn't able to do at Oklahoma? No. Was he still showing the same propensity for certain types of lateness with throws, unwillingness to step up in the pocket, trying to flush too early or just flush outside, being a few beats late in the red zone? Yeah, all those things were still there, but they were winning or they were scoring points, and he was getting away with some of that. Then the second year, yes, there was a new offense. That was a big issue, and certainly that could have made things worse for him too. But on the field, in terms of what he was doing and that he could control, what you saw was, the same issues, and defenses saying, you know what, we're going to take away some of the easier stuff. We're going to make you do some of the things that we know you couldn't do. And as my buddy Eric Stoner said, because I remember watching the Georgia game and writing up a whole thing about, his accuracy stats aren't what you would, his accuracy stats are great, but the context behind them aren't that great. And watch the Georgia game. You'll see what happens when a team with NFL caliber athletes play tight man coverage against his receivers and can get a pass rush on him without blitzing. You're going to see what Baker Mayfield looks like right now. And it's not as warm and fuzzy as people were making it. So it's like, my buddy Eric would say right now, he told me like last week, goes, every game for Baker Mayfield's the Georgia game right now until he can get over the Georgia game and show them that he can win against those types of looks. And he hasn't been able to do that. And so as a result, you that's why you kind of have to say, all right, did he have a bad first year? How does he improve? Did he have a good first half and then a bad second half? Or did he have a good, a bad first half, good second half? Now teams are going to adjust. How does he adjust to the adjustments? Because that's the adversity. And with quarterbacking for sure, it's always about that. It's always about them. Well, we found that out. So how are you going to adjust this? Because you are the strategic lead in the offense. You always have to be adjusting. And if you can't even get past the first level of adjustments in the first year and a half, you're a career backup at best.
And we're kind of seeing that too with, there's quarterbacks, but then there's also offenses. You look at like Carson Wentz on fire, and then what defense is adjusted, I know they're so injured right now. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking the next couple of years, it wasn't the same. Lamar Jackson, it's happening to him right now. They have adjusted. His first half of 2019 wasn't what his second half was, but now they got that tape. Now they're trying to do things and making him, win down the field outside the numbers and seeing what he can do. It's probably going to happen to Kyler, I would say, maybe the second half of this year, something to watch for. Even Patrick Mahomes. Now, he's phenomenal. Don't get me wrong. But record-setting year, and then the second half of last year wasn't actually as amazing. Now again, you could say maybe his knee or something like with some of that, but it's fun to watch the chess match. The
Yeah.
first half of a football game, what happens out of the second half, and who can adjust and who can't, and that's the fun part, because either you're going to have more tools to use, or you're going to just stumble and be like, this is just who we are, and you're going to let other smarter, more adjustable people, beat you.
Yeah. And I think that, when it comes down to scouting players, I mean, I think what people don't realize is, again, just how high a level it is just to be on an NFL roster. Like how good you have to be just to be on a roster. Because from high school, I mean, and I've often talked about it from like a manufacturing perspective in terms of percentage of errors. And we talk about it, from the standpoint of that, if you have, if you're a high school player, you're probably in the top 85 to 90% of all football players. And so if you get a college scholarship or you make it to walk onto a college team and end up being a contributor, you're probably in the top 85 to 95% of NFL of all football players that ever play football. And that's pretty awesome. Like, you're a pretty great player. Like, I think about it this way. I had a bunch of friends, and they tell me this story because they a bunch of my friends had a friend who is a guitar player. He's like this acoustic guitar player who plays around Athens, Georgia. And he's like probably my age now. But when I knew him, he was probably about 10 years older than me. So he was about 30 at the time. He was about 35 years old, long, curly, brown hair, like horn-rimmed spectacles, wear sandals all the time. They called him Sandals. And
That's a nickname.
Mark, and his name's Mark. I won't go get his last name, but Mark played at my high school, ahead of before I ever got there. But he was a running back at my high school, and got a scholarship to Georgia Tech and was Georgia Tech's return specialist and one of their backup running backs. And then he ended up pursuing music after he left Georgia, and he like basically makes a living making lullabies that the local hospital like gives DVDs to parents of newborns, like he of all these guitar things, and he gigs and all this stuff. So you look at him, you think he never played football. So my friends, apparently they were telling a story one day as we were watching football. They said, "Oh, have you ever played football with Mark?" I'm like, "No." And he goes, "Man, we played football with him once. And we decided we were not good enough to ever do that again." And I was like, "Well, what happened?" And he said, "Well," and all these guys I'm talking to were like big dudes. I mean, they were all like 6'3", 6'4", 230 to 250, and some were in pretty good shape. And they, and Mark was more my size. I'm about 5'11" in the 200 pounds range. And like Mark, he said, "Yeah, we kicked the ball off to Mark, and we were playing tackle football. We kicked the ball off in the backyard. And he was wearing sandals still. And he ran through all of us. Like literally, we bounced off him. He made people miss. And we were on the ground and we couldn't get up. Like literally, three of us were like hurt, like legitimately hurt after he ran through us. And we were like, "That's the last time we're playing football with sandals." Like it was just like, and it was because, again, it's like, he played major college football. It's a different animal. And it's like, when you think about it from that perspective, he was probably in the top 85 to 95% of football players. But then you get to the NFL and you're a draft prospect, you're probably in the top 95%. You're in the top 95%. You think, well, that's great, but most of the people who make the NFL, are in the 99th percentile. Not the 95th. You get drafted, you probably in the 95th. You get in a camp, you're in the 95th. You might get a tryout. 99th is if you're going to make the roster, maybe the practice squad.
Yep.
And then 99.5 is probably like you actually are on the active roster and you might be able to contribute. But you're the starters are probably like 99.9. And the guys who are all pros are like 99.99% of people. And when I'd say that is like people who make, major errors, like Ezekiel Elliott, yeah, he's had his worst fumbling year of his career. He's had 4 fumbles this year, 2 in one game. I doubt you're going to see 2 in one game from Ezekiel Elliott for the next 3 years if he plays another 3 years. And if you see more, he's probably not going to be playing anymore.
Right.
Like that'll be the downfall of his career. But this was like a fluke thing. So, I'm sitting here watching John Owen having to answer to people about whether he should be wearing sleeves or not, like late at night after that game last night. And I'm just laughing. I'm going, dude, you ain't going to see that again. Like, that's like catastrophic. Yeah, that was catastrophic for Ezekiel Elliott. No one has to tell. And the fact that even Mike McCarthy, as much as people might criticize him when they asked him at halftime, what will you say to Ezekiel? He goes, I don't need to say anything to him. He knows he's important to us, and he knows the gravity of the situation. And if you couldn't see that on Ezekiel Elliott's expressions and his and the way that he looked when he came off the field and he was hitting himself in the helmet, that this guy was like distraught.
I have a funny story. I don't think I've told you this one before. You're talking about how good you have to be, and one thing that bugs me is people saying, well, I could do that, like playing, football or whatever it is, or even coaching. Like coaching's really hard. If you haven't done it, like it's really hard. But so in 2005 is my first year as a student assistant at Western Kentucky. I'm 21. I'm just doing all the grunt work, but I was there. We had to report before the players. So I think it was like July. It's a nice campus, and I was like, man, it'd be really cool for me to go shoot in the arena, like that'd be cool, D1 arena. So I talk to the strength coaches to go over there, like, oh, the basketball team's actually in there and they're playing up and down. It's like, oh, okay, my bad. And they're like, actually, one of the players sprained their ankle. They need someone to run with them. Could you do it? And I was like, I played in high school, I wasn't great, I was like a 8th man, 7th man, whatever. I played, intramurals in college and, up until I'm like, I'm in good shape. I could be okay. I know what I'm doing, They made me look like I've never played basketball in my life, Matt. Like I would get the ball and I would turn and then I'd be like, where'd the ball go? I mean, you would drive or shoot and they're so long and they anticipate so much, but that just goes to show, I think, that just the level that they are. And then it's all of the details that we're talking about. It's not just the size and athletic ability. It's everything else, understanding the game. And it was such a good perspective for me to watch because, I played, I think we played like maybe 3 games. And that team, was it 3 years later, they went to the Sweet 16. And then they had that last second shot against Drake. I don't know if people remember that one from half court, like the shot of the tournament. And then the year before that, I think they lost. They almost made the Sweet 16 by the last second shot. Gonzaga upset them, or else they would have been 2 in a row. So there's a lot of good players. And Courtney Lee was on that team. He's in the NBA right now. But they would drive and they would take angles, and I'd be like, it's not even in my repertoire even to do. And I'm like, man, but they understand the game at such a different level, and that's what we see with all these moving parts with running backs or with anything of anticipating and their footwork. And just, learning angles and momentum and reading players and defenders. It was unbelievable experience for me.
Yeah. And the thing is, it's funny. They make it look so easy that if you're watching it from afar, that's why you can watch it from afar and go, okay, he should have done that, or he should have done this. After you study it for a little bit, and a little bit could be a few years, it could be years from now. I remember the first time getting into studying tape and looking at Noshawn Marino and looking at some plays and thinking and seeing people criticize stuff at major outlets and thinking, does that really make sense? Is that logical that they're saying that he could have been there and falling, I'd find myself sometimes going to people and going, am I wrong here to say that he missed this? Am I wrong here to say that he didn't see this thing or that he should have cut here? Because there'd be times that I'd look at something one time and say, yeah, maybe you should have seen that. And then I'd look at the scope of the play and realize, oh, well, he's not even looking there. He's not even supposed to look in this direction. Or he's in the middle of making a move. Unless he's unless he can teleport, there's no way he could there's no way he could do that. Like, unless he's like the Nightcrawler, in a whiff of smoke,
Yeah.
he like disappears and
Yeah.
reappears. There's no way that he could humanly possible do that. And you'll see that. Like, I remember somebody commenting Sunday, there was a play. I don't remember who it was, but it was a quarterback. And I was commenting about the quarterback throwing the ball down the field in a certain direction and looking in a certain direction to where he threw. And the guy, I think it was the Eagles game, and one of the fans was like, well, he had the guy open on the left. And so I go back just to look, just to see, because I'm thinking, I bet it's one of those. So it was one of those where like I go back and watch the tape. And then I went back and watched all 22 just for the fun of it to see. And it was one of those plays where basically, sure enough, if he like stopped in mid throw, pulled the ball down, pivoted, and turned back and risked like getting cement rolled, he might have been able to like get the ball off and it would have trickled 5 yards down the field in the direction of that guy who was 30 yards wide open. I mean, it was just like, it's one of those things that it's easy and it's understandable as fans. Like, we've all been there and had those fan moments until you start to really hone in and study and you start to realize it's like, yeah, that guy didn't have a choice. Or like the other thing with running backs. I mean, this is another good subject that I'd love to ask you about. I find that when I'm evaluating players, if I see one mistake, like just one clear mistake, I don't harp on it. What I tend to do is like, I may write it down and go, keep an eye on his tendency with zone plays on cutbacks here, just to see if he does it again and again and again. But I usually don't write it down as like, he can't do this because he didn't do it right once. I want to see, because sometimes it's just a moment where maybe the flash of bodies were too fast and he misread it, and it's understandable. And it's like, that happens. Everybody does it. The great players do it. But what I'm looking for is, does he do it over and over again?
Yeah. So I look at that both ways. So, I mean, like you said, nobody's perfect, but I look at repeatable traits. So is it a repeatable error? Are they doing this? Normally I say 3 to 5 times is what I look for. And then also on the positive, like look at him do this spin move by this guy, or like David Tyree, perfect example, made one of the best catches ever in a clutch situation ever. He did it once. He does that 3 times. He's a starting wide receiver. He does that, 7 times. He's getting a big contract. He did it once. So it's like, is that really who he is? So you really, it's this mystery where like, does he have, like, as you were saying, if it's an outside zone and he can't read this cutback, is that something that's just a blinder in his vision? That's a red flag. If he does it once, everyone messes up, or maybe he was looking at something different, or what was the situation? It was 3rd and 1. He was just getting 1 yard, or whatever it was. But yeah, I look 3 to 5 times both ways if it's a repeatable like trait or skill.
Yeah, me too. And and I just think that's important because it's one of those things where, and then sometimes it's funny because you'll see errors with a player, like he commits an error, but like you kind of mentioned, they do something within that error that's notable, that's a positive. And to be able to, and it's just one of those things you go, well, I wonder if this is translatable to another part of his game. It should be if he can do that, so I don't know. I find that to be a fun part about scouting. And certainly, when it comes to all of this, I mean, man, it's funny. I mean, like we've been doing this for a while now. And it's funny that you said you were 21 because you first wrote me in your early 20s when you were at Western Kentucky. Bobby Rainey was, part of that class that you were part of that team. And I was just starting to study him. And I remember I was asking, it was because Chad Ryder, who was at CBS at the time, wrote me and was like, I think there's this player that I think you'd like. And I want to know what you think of him because he reminds me of Brian Mitchell, the former Washington and Philadelphia special teams expert who was a good backup running back in the league for many, many years, who also was a great special teamer guy. Yeah. And he said he reminds me of Brian Mitchell. And I remember watching Bobby Rainey and being like, oh, yeah, I really like Bobby Rainey. This was great. Good. But this was like this was so many years ago, and it's funny now because like now you're the age I was when we first got in touch,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, I don't know, man, it's just crazy. And it's just like and it's fun to see that you've got like your own Devi report and the work that you do with that. Tell people about like your Devi report and what's in it for people who aren't familiar with it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. The one thing I wanted to start with though is doing this for, and 10 years for me and however long for you. The cool part I think with scouting is I'm always trying to change and like how can I think of this differently than I did then? Like when I first started, I was arrogant. I'm like, "Oh, I know it all." And then you like start peeling back like, "Man, so what's the concept of this play? What was the coaching point? Maybe the coach told him to do something, like you just think of way more, but yeah, so in terms of like my reports, this is the 6th year I've done the Devi report, which for me is really cool because I get to see guys I scouted out of high school. Like if we take over Ronald Jones for example, talk about a guy that's evolved. I scouted Ronald Jones in high school, and him going to USC, and then my report it's all players, well, notable players at skill positions on offense that aren't going to the NFL. So I scouted Ronald Jones out of high school, and then every year looked at his freshman tape, sophomore tape, and then I have the graduates, which is another report that's only it's like your guide, but way way less pages, Matt. I can't do it on your level, but so it's of guys in the NFL draft, and so you watch Ronald Jones, he's 180 pounds, 185 soaking wet out of high school, and he's quick as a hiccup. I mean, it was unbelievable his quickness, and it was still apparent, but he kept packing on maybe 8 pounds per year, and now he's thick, and he's changed his game almost kind of like a Clinton Portis did, where now he's a little bit more of a power guy with a little cutting ability. He's not going to beat everybody with just speed anymore, and that's what's a fun part of re-scouting guys over time, and something that I really enjoy. Like we talked about, like are they improving? Maybe they're getting worse. That happens too, or maybe they got figured out. And then yes, and then the graduates is the other one that I do. That's just kind of the finished
Well,
product.
where can they find it?
You can contact me on Twitter. I have it saved. And honestly, my website, I think it's the Juice of Football. I think I need to like Google that actually. I think that's what it is. It used to be on another one, but I switched it. Let me look real quick.
Okay. Well, I mean, while you're doing that, funny about Ronald Jones, I remember watching him
Yeah,
at USC and thinking he's kind of a Jamal Charles style type of back, like that
he
quick,
was.
just
Yep.
like hit the hit. So, and then it was just like by year two in the NFL, I'm like, I mean, he can cut, he can still make some of those really sharp cuts, but watching him is just like hit that thing downhill and just run through people. And his rate of broken tackles per carry, I think that's what I was looking at as a metric. He was one of the best in the league last year
Yeah.
at breaking tackles.
Yep.
It was like, and it wasn't even close,
Mm-hmm.
in some regards.
I mean, he was my and I got grief from this. I mean, early on but he was my number 2 running back in that class. I had him over Geis, I had him over, and I missed on Chubb. That's one I missed on, but over Michelle, over all of them, and everyone's like, he's terrible, blah blah. And I stuck by him. And right now, you're seeing the one thing I love that I saw when we talk about one of those small traits was I saw his subtle cutting ability. Those small cuts where I think it's super important because when you have a whole defender to get through as a running back, you're not going to succeed very often. But if you can move and only take on half that defender or maybe just his arm, you're going to succeed a lot more breaking those tackles. And he would make just these small little movements to break tackles in college. I'm like, man, he's so good at that, effortlessly doing that and knowing how to be a defender. Sorry, back to it is the juiceoffootball.wordpress.com. That's the site, or you can on Twitter. It's tagged in my or what do you call it? Saved as my top tweet or whatever.
Oh,
but
pinned,
pinned.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And your Twitter address for everybody?
Yeah, at _ Nick Whalen on Twitter.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Good. All right. So yeah, I mean, definitely would recommend checking that out, especially if you're into Debbie. It's a fantastic resource. You're going to get someone who certainly understands the game and isn't afraid to be able to, they're not going to be looking at what other people think. And I hear a lot of people say that all the time. To me, it's just kind of like normal. Like It just seems normal that you're going to go through your own process because how are you else are you going to learn?
Yep.
But it is fascinating that there are people out there that's like, well, everyone else is saying it about this guy, and it's just like you're never going to learn if you
Nope.
go that's.
Nope.
But I've talked about that enough on this type of a show or format in the past. But yeah, I don't know, man. It's this has been a lot of fun for us to be able to do, and I'm definitely gonna have to bring you back on again much sooner than it's been. It's been a long time since we've had a chance to do a show together. I don't think we've ever really done a show together other than like we did one with Dynasty Nerds, last spring, and that was fun. And those guys are great, and that's a great site. And honestly, I mean, like I'm appreciative of that site for the sake that they create prospect videos where they do cut ups. Because whenever I can watch cut ups that are good cut ups, it saves time.
And they cut down the wasted time too. I use them too. I'm like, oh, that's nice. That's way better than me looking at my TV and recordings and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's like as long as they show everything. And I'm just saying to anybody out there, if you're interested in doing cut ups or you're making cut ups and you're listening to this, please do include plays where they don't have the ball or whether they're cutting or they're running or they're blocking or they're doing things that are actually important to their position, even if they're not being targeted or getting a touch with the ball. It's quite valuable to folks like us.
I mean, it's all information in this process. I mean, and that's why I don't like highlight tapes. I want to know the bad plays too, because those are important. Because even if they mess up just once, as we talked about, like Zeke Elliott, it happens. It's okay, but include it in the cut up.
I've watched highlight tapes once. I'll tell you when I watch them. I watch them after I've done all my grades, after I've written them up, after I've pretty much set my rankings, or just before I finish setting my rankings. And I'll go through highlight tapes only to see if I've missed something egregiously great about that player that I haven't already seen. That's it. Like, and usually the highlight tapes are underwhelming after I've watched what I've watched. They're really just like, oh yeah, I've seen that. Okay, I've seen that. Every once in a while, it'll show something. I'm like, oh wow, like you know what? Maybe I need to go back and watch a little more because he did that 3 times and I haven't seen that once. Maybe I haven't. That's usually a shortcut way for me to go. You haven't watched enough. Normally, if there's something, and usually the thing that makes me like lose my mind over a player is usually something that's never in a highlight. It's usually, which is hilarious. It's like, because it's usually something subtle where it's like, how on earth did he make that cut? How on earth did he, did he maintain his balance? And it's usually something like a 3-yard run or a 2-yard loss or something.
That's the stuff we love, man.
Yeah, because those are the plays where you're like, oh, well, that's going to translate where, he can do that and might turn into a 50-yard gain, but it's like it just didn't happen to be one, so they're not going to put it on a highlight. But those plays, what makes such a difference.
What makes it dangerous too, Matt, is we're so biased. That's the thing that's so tough within anything is bias, and especially in scouting, because you might be like, I really want to like this player, so when I watch this, I'm going to want to have positive. But when you watch highlights, is you might put too much weight to the highlights and not on their overall game. And that's why watching them isn't beneficial. Like if you want to look at them and see what is the ceiling, okay, but you don't know what the floor is. You don't know what the everyday game is like for them. And that's why it's really dangerous for people to just be like, oh, this is who they are. Like, did you watch the other games when they didn't do those things really well?
Yeah, I think having that's why, like, from a bias perspective, for me at least, I found having things written down and having criteria is so helpful because it really forces you to, there's times that I'm looking forward to watching players, but because I'm going through a process like right now, like we were talking about changing our processes, I've changed my process. I do this every few years. I'm always, these things I'm adding, and like, I'll see something and I look at a player and I'm like, this isn't defined well. What he did isn't defined well here. Or I'm starting to realize the importance of certain types of release patterns or how they read certain situations or defenses.
Is this still on your chalkboard behind you? Remember we talked about it?
Yeah, some of it was,
Yeah.
but most of it's
Oh,
erased.
okay.
But yeah, I mean, I had just incorporated that, and like, I have like this long list. I mean, like my wide receiver list now, like of stuff that I've added and changed, or things that I've either kind of already been doing, or like, I the sideline hustle is a good example. Drew Lieberman, former Rutgers wide receiver coach, assistant coach. He has a great site on YouTube that I highly recommend, and he defines so many things in such a way that I've had him on as a guest multiple times. And I told him, like last year, I said, I wrote all this stuff down on the board by watching all his videos and defining things and going, yeah, that's the same thing that I look for, but it's defined better.
Mm-hmm.
Or I haven't looked at it this way. I need to define it that way. Or this is something I haven't even incorporated that I should. Or I like that, but I've got that covered,
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of synthesized all that and made a new checklist and regraded, scored everything. And then I regraded some of the players just based on how they would fit if I could from past years, just to kind of look. It's not exact because, I'd have to rewatch them with that standard. But I'm looking at these players again, and it's like, because for the past 4 or 5 years, I have only changed one or two things maybe to that criteria for wide receivers. I could go through that list without even looking at it
Right.
and
Yeah,
know
you
what
know
I'm
it.
looking for. And I knew it like back of my hand because I've done it hundreds of
Mm-hmm.
times already, or thousands probably. Now this is new. So like it's slower. And like
Mm-hmm.
every time I'm looking through the list, what am I looking for here? Did I
Mm-hmm.
catch that? So I'm looking at the game completely new again,
Yeah.
from the standpoint of like, I'm looking for the same things. I know what to look for in a sense. Still, it's not like I'm a complete novice at it.
Right.
It's because of the knowledge I had is still there, but the way that I'm trying to apply that knowledge and look at it is different enough that it feels like I'm starting over, and it's slower for me now, and it keeps me so focused on those steps that I'm not. I think what happens oftentimes when you're doing this and you have that kind of a process, that if you were excited about watching that player, you get so into the nitty gritty about what they're doing that if you forget about whether you enjoyed watching them or not, unless they're just absolutely fantastic,
Mm-hmm.
like, and they're hitting all the marks so early that you've already like been able to like grade everything, and now you're just enjoying watching it
Mm-hmm.
because you're seeing the same things over and again. But that's
And
rare.
and
Most of the time, it's yeah,
and you know what's funny about that? The most like, to what you're doing versus what, like, I guess most people kind of do is most people watch the ball, and that's even like coaching and stuff. Don't watch the ball. You got to watch the other
yeah,
parts of it because there's so many other things going on than like ooh ahs. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
like you're talking about those little things, like we digressing all the way back to the beginning of this is, I did the Kenyon Drake video, and dang it, Mac, I forgot to look at the footwork piece, which we just talked about, which is the thing that I
right.
learned, right? Like, it's not, I need to write it down. That way, when I do it, it's going to be natural to me. So what's one thing, like wide receiver wise, that I can steal from you that you're changed, that you're looking at it differently now?
Yeah. All the different release patterns that they had. Like I remember I was looking at such basic stuff like 3-step and 5-step releases combined with, which were basically stutters
Mm-hmm.
and then arm over, and it's stuff like they teach in high school.
Yep.
Like this is the basic thing. Not, I'm looking at things now like, um, gosh, 2 quick releases, 1 quick releases, 3 quicks, hip shifts, being able to use defining all the different hand movements, like with sheds and arm overs and swims, but also, in addition to rips, and having like everything written out, what they are
Mm-hmm.
and how they're used differently. What do they call? I can't even remember the name of it right now, but like it's like a stick, but it's actually. Let me look it up real quick if I can find
Mm-hmm.
it here.
I'm sure you've seen Doug Baldwin's stuff, right, on releases.
Yes.
Oh, it's so awesome to see him. I love hearing the players talk about it in their own verbiage. I love that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, there's lots of different things like that I look at. There's different types of STEM work, like,
Mm-hmm.
how I've always talked about widening or narrowing, but knowing, what are some of the things that I can look at? Let's see, where's the wide receiver checklist? And that's the thing. Like, see, this is the first year.
Yeah.
I'm still at the point there's things I forget. So like the thing that I was talking about that was a footwork is a trigger step.
Okay.
So it's like a stick, but it's directed downhill, and you'll see someone make a real quick, violent
Mm-hmm.
step and then stop,
Mm-hmm.
and then maybe build a one quick or a hesitation off of that, and then move. That's a trigger step. A
Hmm.
guy who I just saw, Theo Howard out of Oklahoma,
Oh, I remember
uses a
he
trigger
was at
step pretty
UCLA
well.
before, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. I just
Debbie
watched him
report.
this afternoon. Yep, there you go. I just watched him today, and he used a trigger step.
Hmm.
And that's something like those different types of things. Other
Would that be
things I'm
would that be
looking.
to get the DB to react, and then when they reset, then they can adjust? Okay.
Yes, yeah. So it's basically like you're getting them to overreact in a direction, and then you can adjust to that. Maybe you can use that to set up of maybe taking their blind spot a little bit
Yeah.
easier, or that you can set up a second move,
Mm-hmm.
to release against them
Mm-hmm.
because you've gotten them out of their spot. Maybe they were leveraged to one side, and now that you trigger step forward, they overreacted in a
Mm-hmm.
in a way. So there's some of that. Things like taking the back of the defender, always making sure that you're trying to take the back of the defender, or working into their feet,
Yep.
working to their toes,
Stepping on their
all
feet.
those
Yep.
stepping on their feet, all those different types of things, the little nuances where I used a very general,
Okay.
broad definition for all these things. And I decided, you know what? I need to really break this down into the most minutia that I can.
Mm-hmm.
So I wind up having like, I don't know how many I have here, but it's literally the sheet starts, and there's lots of little headings and things, but the sheet starts with criteria at cell number 31 and it ends at 230. So like, it's like, and there's like, there's headings and totals in
Mm-hmm.
there. So I'd say there's probably about 100 different points in
Yep.
here, and I have it graded on a 100-point scale. So some things are getting like zero point 0.1
Yep.
points. Some things are getting 0.25 points. And you might look at it and go, well, how are you going to really tell the difference between someone who's really good and who's
Uh-huh.
not with so much minutia there? But I'm looking at grades now, and these guys are grading lower now than I had in the
Mm-hmm.
past. But there's a separation with this. And I'm also being able to see things a little better, because now the way I'm doing this with an Excel sheet is I can have each game be a column across that on the sheet. So if, say, I watch Theo Howard 12 times, and, 6 of those times he performs something correctly, and then, 2 of those times he doesn't perform it correctly, but then the remaining 4 times he just didn't get a chance to perform it, well, I'm going to give him credit for that overall.
Right.
So I'm going to have like a final grade
Mm-hmm.
for him off of that sheet and say, this is his final grade,
Mm-hmm.
looking at it from this standpoint. But I'm still going to be able to show my readers the breakdown of each
Mm-hmm.
game, so that you can see how I arrived at that process. But that helps me see it in the total as well. So I'm doing a lot of that.
Well, then you
That's
see
changed.
consistency. You know what I mean? Too.
Yes.
So I mean, so I'm gonna record this and put this on my my YouTube as well. Then, so do you
Sure.
want to let people know, I guess, what your work is? Because I mean, if they don't, they should. If they don't, can you let them know what RSP is?
Sure. You can find the rookie scouting portfolio at mattwaldmanrsp.com. That's my site. Or just go directly to buy it. You can buy it at mattwaldman.com. And the RSP is a draft guide specifically geared towards skill position players: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. I've been doing it for 16 years, and it's based on a process that I use, that I borrowed from best practices for evaluating performance. And I used to be a director in an operations and quality sector where I had to learn these kind of best practices, and I applied it to watching football, and added a kind of a fantasy slant to it as well. So where I do like real live I do real football evaluation with these players and look at it from the standpoint of like from actual football. But then I try and make sure that I save some analysis to say, for those of you interested in fantasy, here's kind of, I understand, I can translate back and forth with those things
Mm-hmm.
because I've been a fantasy writer for over 20 years. And so, I work at Football Guys, and that's what, that's what I've been doing. I've been writing about fantasy for many years, and I try and translate it now that. So what I want to do is give people the goods where that I have, scouts who do buy the book, or people who are, personnel folks in major college who've bought the book, who've learned stuff from the videos that I do on YouTube, and like get value out of that. But at the same time, it's something that the fantasy community can look at and go, what's the answers to the tests? But now I want to find out the why behind that. Matt's going to give me all the why I could ever ask for, and more than I would ever probably need.
Tell them how many pages it is. That's the why. Tell them how many.
Yeah, the spelt version last year was 1,100 pages. So that's like that's the smallest it's been in about 5-6 years. And it'll continue to get a little smaller because I'm being able to spend more time. I used to literally show people all my work.
Mm-hmm.
I literally used to write. The way I learned how to do this, because of the process I had, was write down everything that you've defined and write down everything that you see. So I would spend hours and hours. I'd spend 8 hours watching a quarterback in one game, just one game, and literally write down every coverage I'd see, even if I couldn't define that it was a cover 3 cloud or a cover 3 sky, whatever it'd be. I maybe not write it down that way, but what I would do is I would write down what I'd see. The safety was over here. The cornerbacks were playing outside shade. The linebackers, the outside linebacker in the triangle of the safety and the cornerback were doing this. So I would do all that to learn, and then go into the minutia of like, his feet would point this direction, his hips did this, and I did that for literally 14, 15 years, like literally about 13, 14 years. And that crazy minutia got to the point that I really started to learn the game, because I started to go, okay, this doesn't answer my question that I posed as my criteria. So now I've got to change the criteria, because my system was set up to evolve. That's what made it a best practice system, is it evolves by basically, once you can't answer the question with a clear yes or no, that means you haven't asked the right question. So you either have to ask a different question, you have to break the question apart, you have to add more questions in, and I did that over the span of 16 years now. And so now I've gotten to the point where after about 12, 13 years, I was like, I don't need to write everything down anymore, because I'm not getting to watch enough games of the players that I'd like to. And it's taking me way more time than I need to do this. So it's a great exercise, and occasionally I'll still do it because it's a great exercise. It's like playing I Spy with like a microscope,
right.
So like that's what I try and do. But yeah, that's the RSP, and you get a pre-draft, you get a post-draft that's more fantasy oriented. It gives a cheat sheet, and I look at average draft position versus like my rankings and say, I like Patrick Mahomes better than most people, or Nick Chubb better than most people. So yeah, I'm not telling you to draft them first overall, because you don't have to. You can get them at the end of the first round or in the middle of the second round and still get highway robbery out of them, And so I would do stuff like that. And then I have a newsletter that comes out once a month from May through December that also keeps people up to date. And I give them a 3-year look at my rankings from the past 3 years of rookie classes, so that they kind of get a feel for how I see them and where they're at. So that's the RSP.
Yeah. I just want to pull like a couple things out of there, and I don't know how much longer we're going to go on this, because we could go like forever, but just for people that want to do this, or you just want to scout one player or one game, is, I do this, and I know Matt does this. When you watch a player or you watch a play, you're going to watch that play 5 to however many times you need to. You can watch it full speed. You're going to watch it slow down. You're going to watch, and then you're not going to watch that player. You're going to watch the line, both lines, the coverages. You're going to watch all of the parts of it to understand what's going on. And then you could, like Matt has talked about before, you're going to go a little bit and be like, okay, where was his eyes? Where was he looking? Why did he see what he saw? Where were his feet? Like, that's how you study and break this down. And the more that you do it, the faster that you can go. but it takes a lot of time. So if you want to do it really well, it's going to take time, but it's not like there's like a secret sauce to this. You have to put down all those categories, and you have to look at it from a wide net and all these areas. And then it starts, and what's fun is then you start putting plays on top of each other of players doing things consistently, like, oh, this is who Nick Chubb is, or hey, this is who, Ronald Jones is, etc. And then it becomes fun, but you have to take the time, and it takes a lot of time to do it.
It does. And that's exactly it, is that it's painstaking, and that was, I mean, I think I told the story when we had the conversation earlier that we didn't record, but was, my wife, when we first got together, she's not a football fan at all. I mean, she grew up in North Carolina and basketball was king. So, she has a very good business mind. And, when I talked to her about what I was doing, and we talked about, the plans of taking the RSP forward, she would say, are you sure you want to, like, you share everything, you say you share everything you do in the book? Like, are you sure you really want to do that? And I was like, yeah, it's not a problem. I said, it's not a problem. It's okay. Yep. She's like, yeah, but what if someone like takes it and like runs with it and they steal your stuff and they're successful?
Good luck.
I'm like, good for them. I'll shake their hand. And she's like, never really understood what I meant. So like finally, like when we finally had time, maybe it was 10 years into our marriage, because we got lots of other fun things going on that we don't talk about football all that much, other than I'll share some things about my day. And it takes a while to even go through the backstory of it to like even make it somewhat entertaining. So it's not as enjoyable as if like we're talking. So, I finally show her like the book, and she's looking at it and she was like, oh, I totally get now what you're saying. Like, if anyone's going to recreate this, then they've got the same sickness you do. Mm-hmm. And it's like, they're going to work their tail off. And if anything, they're a compatriot, in what you do. And it's not that, it's way harder, because the product is you. It's not it's not the process. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, exactly right. Because the process I learned, but the process is about taking your intuition and putting the skeleton around it, and being able to, that skeleton protects you from your intuition going the wrong way, but it gives you enough space for that intuition to operate in a productive manner. Because people think of intuition. Adam Harstead, who's a writer of Football Guys, was talking about this earlier this week, and he was saying how Bob Henry, who's one of the great fantasy projection guys ever, like, I'll just say this, and, I'm not saying this on behalf of Football Guys. I don't want to get Football Guys in trouble, and it's not anything to do with them. But, Fantasy Pros is a site that grades accuracy, and Football Guys doesn't participate in that. But, Bob Henry is, forget Fantasy Pros and their rankings from the standpoint of like, he's been the best before they ever got started, and he's still the best now.
He's an OG.
And
yeah.
He is. And it's just, what he does is fantastic. His process is fantastic. And if there were a site that didn't have commercial interests that unintentionally or intentionally got in the way of being an objective party in terms of doing projections, which is almost impossible in this environment. So I'm not just saying Fantasy Pros is out for themselves. Right, I mean, that's not my point. If Football Guys were doing it, there'd still be a bias there. But Bob's work is that great in terms of different formats of where they do projection contests. And he's like, and even when Fantasy Pros was grading, he was one of the top 2, top 3 year after year, until they started to make it a pay model. And so, listen, and Adam was talking about that and saying there's intuition involved in that. And he said, I bet Matt, I haven't talked to Matt about it, but I bet the RSP is very much a product of intuition as much as it is a heavy process. And the process is there to help balance the intuition or enhance the intuition. And I was like, yeah, you're spot on. That's exactly what it is. It gives it room to breathe. And so when you're doing all this work, you're doing all this work so you can understand all the things you need to understand so that intuition can come through, because there were times there were players that I would watch early on And I didn't understand the difference between gap and zone when I first started 15, 16 years
Yep.
ago. I didn't understand the, all the different footwork patterns that we talked about
Mm-hmm.
today, or, all the different things that I talk about week after week now. But I would look at players and I'd go, that guy's good. Like that Mike Bell guy, he's good. That Matt Forte guy, he's
Oh
good.
man,
That
that's a good
that
story.
that Darren McFadden guy, I don't know. I don't think he's that good.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't. There's some things about him I don't like, and I would explain some of it, but I wouldn't get all of it. And it was like those things would happen. And so like Mike Bell, I mean, I told that story as the first year. It was like I had him rated like I think fifth or sixth on my board somewhere in there, and he didn't get drafted, and I was like, well, what do I know? I just started doing this, and then he was the starter for the Broncos that year. He's a UDFA, and it made me realize, okay, maybe I'm seeing stuff, but I still have to figure out how to communicate that, because otherwise I'm just leaning too hard on stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'm going to be limited in my knowledge,
Yep.
because the knowledge helps your intuition activate as well, because you have to know these things. You have to understand, all these different components to understand why a player made the choice he did, why Adrian Peterson would try to cut back against the grain on a play where there were more men to the side he's cutting back to
Mm-hmm.
than the side that you would think he should bounce ahead
Mm-hmm.
to. And then you start to, but if you really understood all the technique and jargon, you can look at a player and go, oh, he's breaking the rule, but this is why he wanted to break that rule. And it makes total
Yeah.
sense. And so then you're looking at it and if you've created the right type of process, you can look at that and go, that's a positive. I can't grade him. He would, even my process wouldn't grade him negatively
Mm-hmm.
here, because I've left it open-ended enough to say, does he make the smart decision based on what he's
Mm-hmm.
reading, as opposed to, does he, because some people would look at it and be too prescriptive and say, well, he cut back into too many men, because you would say, well, does he read, is he cutting away from, they might define it as is he cutting away from more men in the box than to less men in the
Mm-hmm.
box? And if you do that, then you're like, you've confined yourself in a way, in the same way that some analytics people used to confine themselves by saying, if he's not 6'2", 210 pounds, then he can't be a starting wide receiver in the NFL. And there were guys that did this in the NFL, and like Dan Hatman would talk about it and say, that's too prescriptive. Like it's good that you want to filter things, but you can't filter it to that nth of a degree or that specifically, or else you're missing out on Odell Beckham Jr. You're missing out on
Steve Smith.
Tyreek Hill, Steve Smith,
Tell him
all
he's too
these,
small.
Antonio Brown.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Tell all those guys they're too small
Mm-hmm.
and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that kind of thing that we kind of get into with that nitty gritty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's I don't know. It's so much fun to like look over time, and just like you were saying, like see like the blind spots,
Yeah.
and then see like the areas to improve. It's that's what makes it fun. Because it makes us continue to do it. You know what I mean? Like people find
Yeah.
it useful, and it's like, man, like this is really fun. And then we talk about it. Like if we were to talk about this, like you said to your wife or someone else, to think we're crazy, but it gets me juiced up. Like I said, the last time we were on this call, so me and Matt recorded for 2.5 hours. I recorded it. I did it wrong. And then we're like, oh no. So that's why we're doing it 2 weeks later. But I couldn't go to sleep. It was midnight. I'm Central Time. It was midnight. I couldn't go to bed for another hour and a half. I was so juiced up, just like learning and talking to Matt about this stuff.
And it's fun because I mean we both we have similar and different perspectives with all how this goes. I mean the closest, like my wife and I find that our careers are very similar, though very different. Like the format is very different, but like certain things that we go through and negotiate and work through, and how the different tools we have to use are very similar. But the bridge that you have to get there to do that takes a lot of layers. Whereas like when you get two people who are doing this, like the fact that we're just doing this, I mean, we may go about it in a different process, but the things that we encounter are the same. We're just going about it from a different direction. So yeah, I mean, this is always a great deal of fun, and it's educational to just kind of look back, because it's like you want to follow your own course, because it's the only way you can really go. But it's nice to check in with other people who are doing this,
Yeah.
so that you can learn. I mean, like, again, like that whole, like, I know I'm going to have to add in somewhere in the next couple of years, is he cutting from a balanced position? Like, that to me, and it's so obvious. Like, I look at it and I'm just like, how did I not think of like doing that? Like, I've been doing this all these years, and like, and it's that same thing. It's like, I could, and say with all immodesty, like, I'm pretty good at running backs. Like, that's like one of my things. And I'm pretty good at that. And I'm like going, how did I not even look at that? Like, that's shameful. I mean, like, and I'm going to laugh. It's not really shameful, but I'm like, there's a part of me that feels that way. That's like, how on earth could I like not look at that? But it's like, but it's like the discovery thing is one of the best things about this. Yeah. And, you want to get it right for your readers, and you want your readers to, but I think, I don't know about you, but I feel like the readers that we have that come back for what they're looking for is someone to describe to them the player accurately, not necessarily rank the player accurately. They want accurate rankings. They may come for that, but in the end, what they're looking for is, an accurate description of who that player is, where he could be good, and where he might be able to get better, or where things could really go downhill for him if he's not in the right spot. And if you give them that roadmap, I think that's enough. And their understanding of, like, they're going to be understanding of failures and things that make, that you have. I mean, like, I laugh because, like, I think about like Hakeem Butler. Like, Hakeem Butler's a good example.
Number one.
Yeah. Both are number ones. And it's just like, people will look at that. Or I had Dante Pettis. I liked him. I know you did.
Well, I like Sutton, remember? And you didn't like Sutton.
Yeah,
so
you like Sutton. Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, I had guys like that. Now, I could sit there, I'll get people on Twitter occasionally. Somebody will mention something, or I'll mention something positive or something going on, and somebody will go, Hakeem Butler, or they'll say Hakeem Bustler. I guess somebody was using Hakeem Bustler as like a meme or a thing. And it's like, yeah. So, I mean, maybe I missed on it. We'll see. He hasn't played yet. So until he gets on the field, I don't know, because I'm sure lots of people would say that they missed on Raheem Mostert, but he didn't get on the field until 6 years, pretty much 4, 5, 6 years into his career. So how much did they miss? How much did they really miss? We don't know. He might not have been a good fit for the system there. Now, odds are likely that we probably did miss because, at this stage of the game, but it's not one that you can go, well, what did I miss? Because until you see it, you don't know. Everyone's got a different process with how that works. But it's like, I look at those and I laugh because it's like, yeah, I mean, you most people understand, like they understand, they look and they go, well, you didn't miss on, Calvin Ridley, you didn't miss on Amari Cooper, you didn't miss on CeeDee Lamb. You're going to miss on some guys, and some of these guys, and there's some guys that they missed on that you were like you were like, nah, I didn't like Dante Pettis, not a big fan of that. I've had guys that I look at and I go, yeah, not for me. I'm not, I've got a decent grade on Mitchell Trubisky and Baker Mayfield, but I'm not recommending you drafting these guys in fantasy leagues. Like,
Trubisky was my one, so there you go.
Yeah. But that's how those things go. And it's like and I think that's why I think they understand that what they want to read is the why. What's the why behind that? And the people who don't, I mean, that's okay. They're the folks in your Yahoo leagues who just want to win in their church league and don't really care about understanding football. They're just trying to make money off of a hobby, and or win. And it's nice to win. And certainly people win using my work. I've had people who've written me and said, I've won high stakes tournaments, and literally have written me telling me and I've posted that on my site, people who've won, who've done, but that doesn't mean that, for the most part, there are folks who want to know the why
Yeah.
too.
I mean,
So
doing this is so humbling. Like, it's like, because I posted my rankings, my top 7 running backs. I literally did after Ronald Jones's game because he had 3 100-yard games. And I got so much grief from everyone just like, oh, Ronald Jones or, Bus Joe or whatever they would, everything. And I'm
yeah,
like, he's kind of arrived. And I'm like, I deserve a victory lap here. And then they're like, oh, look at where you had this guy. And I'm like, nobody's 100% in this. Like, that's the one
right.
thing that you will learn. But what I want to do, and I always put player comps too, which is always risky. But like, what I'm doing is I'm painting a picture for you, painting a whole picture of what their game is through my eyes, my lens, my process. Maybe a guy that the comp is like kind of what they look like to help you, so that when you watch, that gives you at least a baseline for what you're expecting to see from this player.
Right. And that's exactly it. I mean, it's like, and there's so many things that we just don't always know about due to, off field, due to injury issues. I'll have people say, well, are you going to incorporate injury stuff into your grades? And I'm like, no, because there's nobody in the public realm of scouting who literally gets injury reports on every single
No,
player.
they hide
And the
stuff.
injury report, yeah, they hide stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't, and they're not going to get access to that. Even if they have a friend who, works at the Chicago Bears or works for
Mm-hmm.
Carolina and leaks that stuff to them, you're not going to you're not going to get all of that.
No.
So it's like, it's not worth it. I'm not going to bank on a process
Well, I mean,
element.
it's even like, health. I mean, that's high school. Going back to health, do we know what happened in high school and coaching? Like, there's so many off the field stuff we don't know about. Like, how much do they pick
Yeah.
up on learning? Like, we can only see on the field. And what changes a little bit of my stuff from what you do, Matt, is my Devery report is their body types and athleticism changed so much. Todd Gurley was so much smaller in high school than he was his freshman year at Georgia. And
Yeah.
like, that's hard to project, but if you just describe their game, I'm always like up and down, like, oh, this guy got a lot better, this guy got a lot worse. Like, that's what happens.
Yeah. Makes total sense. And it's like, and I mean, I remember, one this way. I mean, I remember talking with Greg Cosell one time, like years ago, and I got a chance to get his number and call him up and interview him. And then we ended up having one of these types of
Mm-hmm.
conversations. It was like a long conversation. It was a lot of fun. But I asked him, I said, it was Ray Rice's rookie year. And I was like, what do you think of Ray Rice? And he's like, yeah, I loved him coming out of school, but I just don't see him becoming a good starter in this league. And I'm like, well, why not? And he's like, he just doesn't have the burst. I just don't see the explosion that I thought he might have. It just wasn't there. And then over the summer, he gained 20 pounds of muscle and added that explosive element to his game that he didn't have and became a Pro Bowl running back. And it's like that kind of stuff. Like it's those things you just don't know. And when you look at a guy like Ray Rice, I don't blame Greg Cosell for not seeing that because I got the hiccups all of a sudden. But
I was wondering
he,
what that was.
he he probably looked at his body type and was like, I don't know if he can add that much more weight without like losing
Right.
something. In fact, he
How much
gained it.
wider can he
So,
get?
right. Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, listen, this was a great conversation. I know we could do a lot more, but for the sake of time, I mean, I think we'll call it here
Yeah.
again. You can find Nick Whalen on Twitter, at Nick underscore Whalen.
At underscore Nick
Uh,
Whalen.
excuse me, at underscore Nick Whalen, at also his Debbie report. You can find that pinned on his Twitter feed as well as God, why can't I remember the name? Dynasty
Yep.
Nerds. They're great. I love them, and I laugh because I had a mind blank with it. But that's what happens when you got a 50-year-old host who's tired. So you can find me at Matt Waldman RSP, at my website and at Matt Waldman on Twitter. And thanks again, guys. And you guys have a good week.